Hey guys, this is a summary of our Week 9 lecture where we're starting to look at how nutrition can affect our training adaptation. So this week we're specifically looking at how carbohydrate ingestion can affect glycogen content and affect our aerobic training adaptations. So do we care about taking in carbohydrate when training if our focus is to maximize the adaptation to training? Now, why is carbohydrate even important? We're going to talk a little bit about why carbohydrate is thought to be important from a classical point of view. Then we'll introduce a new idea that's kind of twisted this perspective lately. So carbohydrate is your high-octane fuel, which just means that you can use it for aerobic and anaerobic exercise, and you tend to get more, well, you don't tend to, you do get more energy from carbohydrate per liter of O2 consumed when you're burning carbohydrate versus when you're burning fat. So you get slightly more energy when you're oxidizing carbohydrate per liter of O2 than you do when you're burning fat. Carbohydrates stored in the body as glycogen, and well, in the liver and in the muscle as glycogen, and glycogen content in the muscle is strongly linked to exercise performance. So the more glycogen you have, the harder you can work and the longer you can work at a given exercise intensity. So glycogen is important for performance. You can manipulate glycogen content by ingesting carbohydrate before, during, and after exercise, and we'll talk about how each of those is important. But we want to see, does performance really result in a better adaptation? So if you can perform better in a training bout, does that mean that you're going to adapt to a higher level during a training program? Our first thoughts are, yeah, you should. Because if you work at a higher level, if you increase your exercise performance, that means that you're increasing the stress that your body has to adapt to, and that should mean a larger training adaptation. So let's start by taking a look at glycogen. We're going to look at pre-exercise muscle glycogen and just how starting levels of glycogen affect performance. And so it's been known for a fairly long time that the more glycogen you have, the longer you can work. It's positively associated with performance. So this is a study where glycogen content was manipulated in just normal recreationally active people through the diet. So a high carbohydrate diet increased the time that these subjects were able to work. One of the reasons is that, well, simply you don't run out of glycogen as quickly. You have more of it, so it doesn't decrease to critical levels, and you're able to maintain carbohydrate oxidation when you have higher muscle glycogen content to start. Now, this is in fact one of the first adaptations that we see with aerobic training. People that embark on an aerobic training program will start to store more glycogen in the muscle. And this is one of the reasons why elite athletes or trained individuals can increase their endurance and work at a higher level because they're storing more glycogen. There's also a whole other host of factors that change with training. For instance, an increase in oxidative capacity, the number and the size of mitochondria. That definitely contributes to an increase in endurance and an increase in performance, but increased glycogen content also contributes. So the first paper that we're looking at this week really wants to characterize how we use muscle glycogen. So we typically think of exercise intensity as the main dictator of fuel selection, whether we use fat or carbs. We want to see, though, how glycogen content and intensity relate. Which one has a greater influence on carbohydrate oxidation? And this can relate directly to a population at large. If you're trying to train someone in a certain respect, you can tailor the exercise to maximize fat use or maximize glycogen or carbohydrate use. What if we give carbohydrate during exercise? So 2 trials were done in this figure here, same subjects, but in one trial they were given carbohydrate, whereas in the other, just an artificially sweetened placebo. So you couldn't tell that you weren't given carbohydrate, but the fact is you weren't. Main finding is that endurance increased by 1 hour when you were given carbohydrate, which is huge. 1 hour of extra exercise performance is massive. Now this is probably on the high end because this is an elite cyclist, so they can probably push themselves a bit harder. You might not see an extra hour of endurance at 71% of VO2 max in just a recreationally active person. But they worked for 1 more hour when given carbohydrate. Now, although that was the only thing manipulated in this study, we want to say that this performance result is due to the carbohydrate, but it's possible that there's a pre-existing difference in glycogen content between the two groups. So we're not too sure if performance was improved, 1, because of the carbohydrate given during exercise, or 2, because glycogen content was slightly higher at all time points in the carbohydrate group. But we're leaning towards the fact that we gave carbohydrate during exercise because we can see some evidence that contributes to this picture of fatigue by looking at plasma glucose. We see that it's maintained in the carbohydrate group and it decreases pretty sharply in the placebo group, which could contribute to fatigue in that group. So you would have to redo this experiment and make sure that glycogen content was the exact same at the start in order to know for sure, but we're pretty convinced that giving carbohydrate during exercise is good for performance. Now, if you combine these two ideas, alter glycogen content at the start of exercise, and then either give carbohydrate or withhold carbohydrate, you can really see an effect on performance. So, if you have a high glycogen content at the start of exercise and you're given carbohydrate during exercise, you don't see a drop-off in the self-selected power output during a performance trial. That is, that the exercise doesn't feel as hard and you can maintain that power output throughout the entire trial without really fatiguing. On the other hand, though, if you have low glycogen content and carbohydrate is withheld during exercise, you see a pretty sharp decrease in the ability to do work during this performance trial. So fatigue is accelerated, the workload that these subjects decided to work at decreased as you got through the performance trial. So what probably happened in that situation is they ran out of glycogen or got to a critically low level, blood glucose decreased, and carbohydrate oxidation was compromised. We don't have the data to show that in this presentation, but that's probably what happened. Regardless, you can see that carbohydrate allows you to maintain performance. No carbohydrate or less carbohydrate will compromise that performance. Now, what about carbohydrate after exercise? Should we resynthesize glycogen in recovery from exercise? Now, one thing that you guys should think about is not so much that resynthesizing glycogen will help with the immediate exercise situation, but once you're done exercising, if you have low glycogen and you don't do anything about it, your glycogen will stay low throughout the day or the next couple hours until you move to the next exercise bout. If your glycogen stays low after exercise, that low level of glycogen persists, and that's now your pre-exercise muscle glycogen content for the next training bout. So that's a low glycogen situation before the second training bout. So you want to resynthesize glycogen right after exercise so that if you move on to a second or a third or a fourth exercise bout, that glycogen content is high in the muscle. Now, this study compares low glycogen and low carbohydrate and high carbohydrate doses on their ability to resynthesize muscle glycogen. Low carbohydrate isn't really that low in this study, a total of 324 grams of carbohydrate in 3 hours that they were given the supplement, versus high carbohydrate, which is just over 400 grams, and you can see that both of them were equally effective in restoring glycogen. And just as an interesting side note, well, you can see there's no additive effect of increasing carbohydrate. It seems that if you get to a sufficient level, if If you have enough carbohydrate, then no more will help you. It doesn't really benefit you to add any extra. And the same thing goes for protein. If you have sufficient carbohydrate, adding protein doesn't do anything to resynthesize glycogen content. Now, there's a distinction to be made here. Keep in mind that we're talking about resynthesizing glycogen, not building muscle proteins, which is typically what you look at when supplementing with protein. So there might be a role in recovery of the physical contractile apparatus of the muscle with protein, but as far as resynthesizing glycogen goes, protein doesn't help. So why would we ever question carbohydrate replacement? Our performance is really high when we have high muscle glycogen content to start, when we're given carbohydrate during the exercise, and if we replace carbohydrate after exercise, then we're getting back to a high glycogen level for subsequent bouts. So why would we ever question replacement of carbohydrate? Well, it seems that some of the signals that get sent in the muscle can respond to nutrients. We saw one example earlier in the class where PPAR, which is an enzyme involved in fat oxidation, can be activated by omega-3s. And so if there are signals in the muscle that can respond to glycogen, that might change the stimulus to adaptation, training. It might allow you to train to a higher level. Some proteins have what's called a glycogen binding domain, and we talked in class about how some of these proteins are bound to glycogen when you have high glycogen, and then as you use glycogen, they're released. Now, when they're released, they can go into the cell and activate other proteins and possibly stimulate the response to training to a higher level than just doing the exercise itself. So, if you have lower glycogen, more of these proteins are giving you more of a response and hopefully increasing your adaptation to training. And you can see that on this schematic that we've gone through in a fair bit of detail, but I'll go through it again quickly here. This just shows you how aerobic training adaptations are mediated. So exercise activates a signal. On this figure, you're seeing exercise activate AMPK on the right. It also does some stuff on the left that we're not really interested in right now. But it activates some proteins, which activate other proteins, and then other proteins, and it continues along in the chain until we get to this master regulator that's involved in the aerobic adaptation process. So PGC1 alpha is a protein that dictates which genes get turned on in response to exercise. PGC just means PPAR gamma coactivator, which simply means that it works together with PPAR. You can see at the very bottom of the screen, PPAR and PGC1 are bound to DNA together, and that increases fatty acid oxidation. If one of those weren't there, then you wouldn't get an increase in fatty acid oxidation gene transcription. So they both need to be there. But PGC1 doesn't only work with PPAR, it also works with things like on the left, MEF2, and then a whole bunch of other factors. It has a main role in dictating which genes turn on. And so when you train, you can't train after just one bout. One activation of this pathway isn't enough, but you have to keep reactivating this pathway by exercising repeatedly over a number of weeks, and you get a gradual accumulation of proteins. So you get a gradual accumulation of new mitochondria, of oxidative enzymes, of GLUT4, of a whole bunch of things in the cell that allow you to exercise better next time. And so what we're thinking happens with glycogen, that you can see on the top right, is that if some of these proteins that are bound to glycogen initially are released with exercise, or if you exercise with low glycogen, so more of them are already in the muscle, then we can activate P38 and AMPK to a greater extent than with just exercise. Now, if that happens, That's going to increase the signal to activate PGC1, and then you're going to get more gene transcription and more mitochondrial biogenesis than you would have if you were just relying on exercise. So the reasoning behind training with low carbohydrate is that if we can activate those nutrient-sensitive proteins to a greater degree, it could result in a greater training adaptation. So we might want to think in terms of train low, compete high. That is, train with low muscle glycogen, compete with high muscle glycogen, because that might maximize the adaptation to training and possibly performance during the actual competitions, whatever you're training for. We're going to look at that in 2 papers this week. One of them that looks at, on the short term, in response to one bout of exercise, what genes are turned on, and are they turned on to a different extent with low muscle glycogen? So that's paper B, the Pilgard paper. Paper C then extends that because we don't really care about only one exercise session. We want to know, if we link a bunch of these together, does it result in a greater adaptation to have trained with low muscle glycogen during 2 or 3 weeks of exercise training? Do we see a greater adaptation, and does that relate to a change in performance of the muscle?